At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Invited by President Roosevelt to the first major world financial meeting since the London Conference of 1933, they will work in the seclusion of this White Mountains resort. Zhang Shi-kung, one of China's representatives, with Secretary and Mrs. Henry Morgenthau. United States Treasury Secretary Morgenthau heads the American delegation. On the opening day, in his role of acting conference president, he addresses the meeting. To be discussed are plans for the stabilization of world currencies. All agreements must be ratified by the governing bodies of the nations involved before becoming effective. Delegates to this monetary and financial conference pose on the hotel lawn. These meetings are designed to promote trade in the post-war world and to create a foundation for lasting peace.
Hello, today we're going to follow up on something we began talking about in Chapter 4 when we were discussing neoliberalism, and that is the institutions, the structures that came out of the Bretton Woods Conference. The Bretton Woods Conference consisted of 44 allied nations from US, Canada, Western Europe, and they all went to Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to the Mount Washington Hotel. And I began this video with the news clip, so you kind of got a general description of what was going on there. But it was basically a 3-week conference, and the goal was to open up trade and to set up an international monetary system of currencies. And so the idea was that each country would set up a monetary system which would peg their currency to the value of gold at the time. And each country would participate in the international monetary system, which would tie everybody's currency to gold, and it would be regulated by the International Monetary Fund, and also the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development came out of Bretton Woods, which becomes eventually part of the World Bank. The reason that the conference came about is because after World War I, there were too many unrecoverable loans as the result of a really confusing monetary system, and these loans had been used to finance World War I. Of course, a lot of money was owed to the United States by Great Britain, but Great Britain was also owed money by France, and there was also some fear among the advanced industrial countries that if currencies weren't set to a certain standard, that other countries could manipulate the value of their currencies to take unfair advantage and to build up trade surpluses and so forth. I'll explain that in a little more detail here in a little bit. But in the 1930s, there was a banking crisis in 1931, and then of course we had the Great Depression in the United States, but really all over the world. As a result, in large part because of a lack of kind of an international monetary order and rules about trade and so forth, there was a global crisis. So a lot of instability, and so these countries came together to Bretton Woods to try and fix it. Let me give you a couple quick examples of the problems that the Bretton Woods system was supposed to fix. So let's say there are two countries competing against each other in the terms of trading. So what can happen is that if they're trading to a different country, if different countries are choosing, let me give you a concrete example. Let's say that it's beer. let's say the United States is exporting beer and Canada is exporting beer, right, to other countries. And other countries are looking for the best deal on beer. It's a really stupid example, beer, but it works, okay? So if the United States, for example, were to lower its currency value in relationship to Canada's, then basically foreign dollars would buy more beer than they would have been able to buy in the United States prior to reducing the currency, because you have to exchange currencies, right? So foreign currency has to be exchanged for U.S. currency. If that foreign currency is worth more in the United States than it is in Canada, because the United States lowered its currency value, then basically that makes for a giant beer sale. And so we would assume that many countries, assuming they don't prefer the taste of Canadian beer, would increase their importation of American beer. And that would go with any product, whether we're talking about steel or agriculture and so forth. So it's not that currencies would not fluctuate. I mean, values of currencies fluctuate all the time. But they needed it not to be arbitrary, and they needed it not to be set just by leaders in a nation who are trying to gain some sort of advantage on the global market. They needed it to be set to something real. And I guess in this case, the real value is gold, even though gold is a mineral and we just sort of imagine and all agree that it's worth a lot of money. But in any case, everybody agreed on the gold standard, and it was pegged to the gold standard. Another goal of the conference was to open up trade. And the tariff, I think we may have discussed this previously, but let's just talk about a tariff, which is just simply a tax on imports. So if Canada was to import beer into the United States, and we were worried that everybody would stop buying U.S. beer and start buying Canadian beer, one thing we could do to protect American beer is to have a tariff, which would be a tax on the importation of Canadian beer. So, if the Canada beer came in for $10 a six-pack and American beer was $12 a six-pack, that's a little expensive. Let's just say it's premium beer. Well, then again, we assume we're in a situation where customers might want to buy the Canadian beer because it's $2 cheaper. However, a tariff, if we're concerned about that, we can just slap a $2 tariff on each six-pack of beer, which would bring the beer up to the same cost, basically, as the beer in the United States. So tariffs have been widely used, and they are still widely used, and they're used to protect the goods and services and so forth from being driven out of business by low-cost imports. But of course, the problem with that is when you're talking about countries that protect their own products but insist that everybody else open up trade for the exportation of products from that country, it's not fair. It can result in an unfair trade balance where one country is getting lots and lots of money for its exports, but not, having to pay a lot of money or having to buy a lot of imports. So that was a problem, creating lots of imbalances in trade and money. It kind of boils down to money coming in and out of countries. And so the second part of Bretton Woods was to have some trade rules about the balance of trade and so forth. And this is what eventually resulted in the World Trade Organization, which is the WTO, and it is basically in place to consider different laws and regulations about international trade. And also, I mentioned before, it's sort of a trade court. If there are disputes, they will go before the WTO and often resolve them, which means that sometimes two countries in a trade dispute, one country does not get its way, and this is what we're talking about when we're talking about sovereignty of a nation, because a nation under these rules can be made to comply with a certain trade regulation, or the WTO can say that they're going to approve sanctions against that country, and so then you can have sort of a trade war, and that's not very good for anyone historically. Okay, so basically, Bretton Woods was an attempt to level the playing field, importantly here, for leading nations, namely Europe and the United States, later Australia and Japan. But importantly, the global south is kind of left out of these negotiations and these rules. I mentioned that exchange rates became tied to gold. This was very important. And the rule was that fundamentally, governments could not change their exchange rates unless there was this big disequilibrium, unless it was evident that the currency was overvalued or undervalued in relationship to the price of gold. Currencies became convertible between all countries, so that means you can go to a different country under Bretton Woods and exchange your currency for foreign currency of the same value, which again really helps the market. And also, if you're going to be in the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, that's what later became the World Bank, then if you are going to be in that, you have to be a member of the International Monetary Fund. Now, the World Bank is kind of the third institution here that people talk about coming out of Bretton Woods, and that is basically to find investment, to locate foreign investment for countries trying to open up their doors to trade and foreign investment. So let's talk about the functions of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and then we'll talk about some criticisms. All right, first, the International Monetary Fund. Of course, proponents will say that because the International Monetary Fund exists, we do have an international monetary system, at least among the members of the IMF, and it is able to adjust exchange rates and deal with macroeconomic policies. It's sort of stabilize the international monetary system and finance so that we don't have these large fluctuations in trade imbalances. And I didn't mention earlier, maybe the most significant reason that Bretton Woods came about is not because of those economic problems per se, but because they caused such conflicts between countries that many were arguing that World War I was in part the result of the absence of any kind of international regulatory apparatus and monetary system and trade rules and so forth. So they were really trying to create peace, was a stated goal. Create peace through economic order. And so the supporters would say that the IMF has been successful at doing that and saying it's a key institution and also enables the global economy to expand. Now the World Bank, their role is to encourage the development of productive facilities. So countries, at first when Europe was trying to rebuild, the World Bank would help with bringing in investors and companies and people to help rebuild. With poor countries, the same kind of thing happens, only they're not rebuilding. Usually they're just trying to develop. But they need, perhaps they don't have all the private capital they need, so the World Bank will give them what they call seed money, or they will just loan them large sums of money to get them going in the hopes that international investment will follow. And they do encourage international investment to expand trade and to create more development in poor countries. So what it's intended to do is to use money, the World Bank, to help member countries improve their productivity, their standard of living, and labor conditions. And again, first these are sort of the goals in rebuilding Europe and among the leading countries in the world, but then later applied to third world countries, poor countries trying to develop. Now the criticism of the World Bank is that it uses its funds to promote neoliberalism. And this has drawn a lot of very strong criticism, especially when we're talking about Africa, because there is an argument that the World Bank sort of gutted the public sector of Africa, so it made it reduce its investments in education and infrastructure, technology, water, and so lots of things that benefit the public health care, and put that into developing the economy and becoming business friendly. But the problem is that that public sector void, which was supposed to be filled by private sector businesses, was never filled. So what you had then was a lack of education and healthcare and adequate infrastructure and roads and so forth, and the money never came to improve those things. So there was a large void, which made Africa, all the more poor and having all the more economic difficulty than it already had. In terms of the IMF, there were also several criticisms. The IMF usually encourages privatization of state-run systems. So what we talked about with the World Bank, they often work together with the IMF, the World Bank with the capital and the IMF, sort of the policies of structural adjustment. And the criticism is that they often, again with this sort of shock doctrine ideology, they impose these reforms too quickly, which reduces the quality of service for those, healthcare, education, anything that was provided by the government. They also push, the criticism is they push trade liberalization on smaller countries, but when they do this, they usually make them open up their doors. In other words, they make them accept and purchase imports. So again, get rid of the tariffs, purchase imports, sell your exports. But what happens usually is that there are not enough exports to make up for the jobs that are lost due to cheap imports. So these poor countries get flooded, usually by countries of the global north, with cheaper products and so forth. So they have trade liberalization and privatization and so forth before there's a regulatory framework in place and before there's some protections for people in these countries who lose their jobs. So where this is imposed, the World Bank and the IMF comes in and does structural adjustment, what other critics call neoliberalism. It often results in high unemployment, the decline of public services or the absence of public services, and without the kind of economic improvement and improvement in the amount of capital and gross national product and so forth that they are promised when these reforms are implemented. And just to summarize, it happens in 1944 as a result to a lot of economic upheaval that arguably is causing wars. It establishes the International Monetary Fund, and it establishes the World Bank, and then it has the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which later becomes the WTO. So those are the three important institutions. In 1971, they abandoned the gold standard, and after that time, there are a number of difficulties. They become subject to the criticisms of neoliberalism, but in spite of all these criticisms, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization are still three very powerful institutions, even though they're not doing the exact same thing for the exact same reasons as was promoted and passed at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944.